A president dead, a nation in shock, an assassin silenced. This was the infamous reality that would fall upon the United States on one single weekend in 1963. It began with a visit to Dallas, Texas by 35th US President John F. Kennedy, a visit that would end in horror and bloodshed when he was assassinated at the hands of a hidden sniper. But it didn't end there. Just 2 days after the police believed they had caught their man, the alleged assassin Lee Harvey Oswald was himself shot and killed by a local businessman named Jack Ruby. It was this second shooting that really helped seal the whole event's place in infamy, spawning a suspicion and skepticism that persists to the present day. Why did Jack Ruby decide that day to shoot Oswald and effectively rob investigators of answers forever? The official investigation, known as the Warren Commission, believed he acted alone. A later one by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, or HSCA, were a bit more skeptical of this conclusion, but still found no evidence that Ruby was part of any conspiracy. Even with these conclusions, the nature of the shooting has nonetheless generated many theories around the mysterious Jack Ruby, and lead us to ask these simple questions. Just who was Jack Ruby? Was he just a lone loose cannon, or was he an accessory to a conspiracy? Why did Jack Ruby shoot Lee Harvey Oswald? To begin to understand this and the most infamous and shocking weekend in American history, we first have to cover a basic understanding of his target, the irony of an assassin who was himself assassinated. Lee Harvey Oswald was a perplexing man emerging from the unhappy beginnings of an unstable childhood. Perhaps looking for order in his life, at 17 this rather lost sheep joined the US Marines, but it would be a match that wouldn't particularly last. You see, as a young man, Oswald had taken more than a passing interest in Marxism. In the context of an early Cold War US Marine, this was a big no-no. He was honourably discharged in 1959, but then without a second thought defected to the United States enemy, the Soviet Union. After much difficulty, they eventually allowed him to stay, only for Oswald to get bored of the drab lifestyle there and return to the US just a couple of years later. This did little to kill the enthusiasm he had for his communist ideals, however. In fact, Oswald was rather a fan of Cuba's new cigar-smoking communist leader Fidel Castro, and when back in the US he spent some time in New Orleans handing out leaflets for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a pro-Castro group. By the autumn of 1963, Oswald was living in Dallas, Texas, and got an entry-level job at a building that would soon become shrouded in infamy, the Texas School Book Depository. That November, President Kennedy was coming to town, and just days before his arrival, Oswald learned from the newspapers that the motorcade was going right past his place of work. One can only imagine how much his eyes must have widened. For in that moment, for reasons we still do not fully understand, Oswald decided the president would die. Months earlier, he had already tried to assassinate a right-wing general named Edwin Walker. Now, same rifle in hand, Oswald was determined he would not fail again. And so we find ourselves at the infamous date, Friday the 22nd of November, 1963. As his colleagues clock out for lunch, Oswald sneaks upstairs and takes his position in the corner of the 6th floor. As the clock ticked over to 12:30 and the presidential limousine rolled into view of his window, Oswald seized his moment. 3 shots, 1 miss, 2 hits. Later that afternoon, the 35th United States President was dead. The fugitive Oswald could not hide for long and was apprehended in a cinema, but not before he had also shot and killed a Dallas police officer, J.D. Tippit. His freedom was now at an end. Or at least, that's the official narrative. But as you probably already know, virtually every detail of what I've just said is argued over like a verbal tug of war. Theories over Oswald himself are a whole other can of worms that we won't be diving into in this video, but instead we will look at the man who is about to give Oswald a taste of his own medicine. For a mere 48 hours after shots rang out from the depository, Oswald's story was about to come to an abrupt end. Sunday, November the 24th. Lee Harvey Oswald is being marched through the basement of Dallas Police Station towards an armoured car that will transfer him to the county jail. In the full watchful eye of live news cameras, a man jumps out from the crowd and fires a pistol right into Oswald's stomach. In the chaos that follows, 20th century America's most famous alleged assassin is little more than a crumpled heap on the floor, barely clinging to life. Later that day, at the very same hospital where President Kennedy was treated 2 days earlier, Lee Harvey Oswald is proclaimed dead at the age of 24. In one rapid flash of noise and smoke, a suspect had been silenced forever, the world had been robbed of answers, and a man named Jack Ruby had thrusted himself into the spotlight. Monday, 25th November 1963. The most chaotic, gripping, and frankly unbelievable weekend in American political history has finally come to an end. Both the president and his assailant lay dead. To some angry Americans, the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald represents swift justice, but to most, it robs the American public of the answers they desperately sought as to why this murder happened. Either way, all eyes were now on one man, and scrambling to answer two simple questions. Who is Jack Ruby, and why did he do it? Now, on the surface at least, the first part of that question would seem simple enough. Nightclub owner, struggling local businessman, man who professed to love Kennedy. When he learned of the assassination on that fateful Friday afternoon, Ruby was hit with an overwhelming wave of despair and worry. The worry came from a rather dark place, for Ruby came from a Jewish background and in his life had experienced anti-Semitism, even shortening his original surname of Rubenstein. A fear that Jewish Americans might be blamed for Kennedy's assassination quickly swept over him, continually occupying more and more of his thoughts. That same Friday night, the soon-to-be killer came face-to-face with Oswald for the first time. He watched as the arrested suspect was presented to the world in a press conference at the police station. Now you may be wondering, how does an everyday small-time businessman get into that room in the first place? The simple answer is that he pretended to be a reporter to gain access, but there's also a little bit more to it than that. Through his extroverted if unpredictable personality and jovial offer of the occasional free whiskey, Ruby had befriended many police figures who had paid visits to his nightclub. The police station, to him at least, was familiar territory. Perhaps within the force there was an element of, meh, we know this guy. It was partially this relaxed attitude that would rear its head and bite them in the backside, whilst derailing the Oswald investigation forever. Having just wired some money to one of his nightclub dancers at the downtown Western Union that Sunday morning, Ruby then slipped into the police station unnoticed. How he did so still being a matter of debate, spotted Oswald, and the rest is history. As for why he did it, his answer was pretty simple: to spare the widowed Jackie Kennedy the pain of testifying at Oswald's trial. He also reportedly told investigators that he felt he had to show the world, quote, a Jew has guts, underlining how his fear of an anti-Semitic backlash might also have compelled him to act. In February 1964, Ruby's trial began. Unfortunately for him, he was represented by a bungled defence that descended into a bit of a circus. They sought to prove that Ruby had been temporarily insane at the time of the shooting as a result of a very specific condition named psychomotor epilepsy. Flawed and flamboyant, this approach failed spectacularly, and Ruby was sentenced to death. His attorney Melvin Belly sent scurrying away with his tail between his legs. He appealed his sentence and in the meantime gave testimony to the Warren Commission set up to investigate the president's death. The commission would crucially determine that Ruby acted alone in the shooting and that he had no prior connection to Oswald. Eventually, due to an error of some improperly given evidence in Ruby's original trial, in October 1966 his conviction was overturned. A new trial was planned with the intention that it be held outside Dallas, to avoid the intense media circus that had plagued his first one. But this victory would prove to be hollow, for Ruby's health had now deteriorated beyond repair. On January 3rd, 1967, Jack Ruby died from a pulmonary embolism at the age of 55. So we find ourselves in the reality that just 3 years after Oswald's death, The assassin of the assassin had now died as well. Sound suspicious? Many seem to think so. In fact, this word goes a long way to describe how Ruby is viewed today in general. So was the official explanation that Ruby acted alone an accurate one, or did his reasoning for shooting Lee Harvey Oswald come from somewhere much more sinister? From the very moment that Jack Ruby buried his pistol in Oswald's stomach, the public attention surrounding the Kennedy assassination went into overdrive, a state it has remained in ever since. It is important to preface any discussions about Ruby by first remembering that official investigations such as the Warren Commission and HSCA never found any evidence to suggest that he was part of a conspiracy. But this has done little to extinguish the flames of suspicion that have engulfed Ruby ever since. If there is one thing that manages to raise eyebrows and spark debate for many who have studied and written about this case over the years, it is this: Ruby's connections to organised crime. Now, the extent to which Ruby had a foot in the criminal world is, surprise, a point heavily debated. You see, Ruby had contact with some pretty shady characters throughout his life, both as a young man in Chicago and nightclub owner in Dallas. But, under examination, a lot of these were found to be pretty loose associations, barely the sort of relationships upon which you could pin an assassination mystery. Proponents of the idea that Ruby was acting according to the whims of organised crime point to one particularly interesting information source: his phone records. Through October and November of 1963, there was an unusually large hike in the number of long-distance calls he was making, mainly to crime-connected figures. These calls were explained in a large part as a struggling businessman Ruby crying out for assistance against his local competitors. For some of these competitors were using amateur dancers in their nightclubs, undercutting Ruby's livelihoods and costing him some serious cash. The HSCA could not entirely discount the possibility that some of these phone calls may have discussed other, more sinister topics. There's another factor that fueled suspicion around Jack Ruby: his visits to Cuba. Now, in the days before Cuba was painted in the red of communism by the bearded and cigar-loving Fidel Castro, the island was a paradise for the American mafia, where gambling, prostitution, and corruption ran riot. It was in this environment in the late 50s that Ruby came to visit his friend Louis McWillie. McWillie worked in a Havana casino under the ownership of one of the mafia's most powerful figures, Santo Traficante. Of course, this was before Kennedy ever became president, but to many, the visit seemed suspicious nonetheless. Now, with all these different points of discussion, the organised crime, the Cuba connection, you may be asking, what do they have to do with the Kennedy assassination, if anything at all? The narrative seeking to tie it all together goes something like this. The mob hated Kennedy, who'd initiated a crackdown on their activities. They also hated that he'd failed to wrestle Cuba back from Castro and bring it back into the American sphere of influence. Not only had he failed in 1961 with the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion, but a year later also pledged that the US would not make any more attempts at invasion following the Cuban Missile Crisis. Persecuted at home and losing money abroad, the mob therefore used Oswald to assassinate the young president, before using their associate Jack Ruby to play the role of silencer. Whilst Oswald's role is less clear, his claim upon arrest that he was just a patsy is seen as evidence that he may have been put up to it. This all makes for a grandiose, Hollywood-worthy narrative, but one for which specific and direct evidence has never been found. In the HSCA's conclusion, they ruled out involvement from the leaders of the National Crime Syndicate, but could not rule out the possibility that criminal individuals could have still been involved. This does of course leave the door open to the idea that Ruby knew more than he was letting on, but with a lack of direct evidence tying him to any kind of conspiracy, this theory does feel just a little bit of a stretch. This lack of evidence summons the inevitable question, one that some listen to with disbelief. Could he really have just been a loose cannon acting alone? At the risk of spoiling the party, one of the most simple assertions suggesting that Ruby did act alone comes from a factor that lies right in front of us: the man's personality. Let's just consider for a moment. Someone characterized as brash, erratic, and volatile would hardly seem to fit the bill of a person you'd trust to carry out such a high-stakes role in a conspiracy, even more so trusting that same man to keep the secret afterwards. For the crazy and unpredictable Ruby, his actions of that Sunday morning as we understand them seem to actually support this. For here's the thing, when Ruby arrived in downtown Dallas that morning, Oswald wasn't actually meant to be there. In fact, his transfer had been due to happen over an hour beforehand but had been delayed at the last minute. Once Ruby was done at the Western Union, the massive activity around the nearby police station simply caught his eye and drew him in, leaving his beloved dog behind in the car. If the shooting had been pre-planned, then why would he arrive into town over an hour late? And why also bring his dog knowing that he would be arrested? Once in Oswald's path, his unstable personality that thirsted for recognition, mixed with his growing fear of an anti-Semitic backlash, were theorized to be the driving forces that compelled him to pull the trigger. Before long, the confinement of prison bars and intense media circus that encircled him began to chip away at his sanity as well, and sink his unstable personality to new depths. Though even the origins of this have been contested. Some claim his mental decline was purposely made worse by the psychiatrists close to him, whilst others believe it had started long before Kennedy had even touched down in Dallas. Now clearly a shell of a man, witnesses listened as Ruby started to give contradicting and increasingly delusional statements over the assassination, and his belief that Jews in America were now being massacred as a result of his actions. As you can probably see from all this, there is so much to decipher regarding Ruby, his associations, his personality, and his actions. With there being so many thousands of witness statements, books, and theories, we've barely scratched the surface of the complexity of the vigorous debate that permeates virtually every aspect of both Ruby and Oswald in this story. But if you're still following, there is one final point to consider, and if this doesn't encapsulate the entire discourse surrounding Ruby, then I don't know what does. In June 1964, as Jack Ruby was about to begin his testimony to the Warren Commission, he desperately asked to be moved to Washington first, believing that he and his family's lives in Dallas were in great danger. He insisted that he could only safely give true testimony if taken out of that environment, a request that the Commission denied. Did they see through it as the blabbering of a man who was clearly paranoid and unwell, or as some theorise, was it merely done to ensure that Ruby could not reveal the hidden bombshells that he had to share? It's a point that will ultimately be contested for as long as this case continues to be in the public eye. As far as we know, Jack Ruby was not part of any broad conspiracy surrounding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. To the best of our knowledge, he acted alone when he shot the president's assassin Lee Harvey Oswald just 48 hours after Oswald had fired infamous shots of his own. It was the perfect storm of an unstable and volatile man, insecure about aspects of his own identity and supposedly grief-stricken over the president's death, simply wandering into an environment to which he was welcome, towards an opportunity that presented itself. But more than 60 years on, debate over Ruby, Oswald, and the Kennedy assassination in general understandably still persist, and will likely continue to do so forever. As always, we hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more from the Assassinations Archive.